Thank you for joining us. The webinar will begin in 3 minutes. Thank you all for joining us. The webinar will begin in 1 minute.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Bend Chamber Impact webinar, and today's topic is workforce trends. And I'm sure that many of you attending today are experiencing similar effects of the Great Resignation and some of the other things that have been going on actually before COVID even started. Really excited to just get some data and a good look around in our market, what's happening right now in the workforce, and by industry sector, and what trends we should be paying attention to. Before I get into that even more, I want to take the time to thank our sponsors today, which are Miller Lumber and Sunwest Builders. Without their help, we couldn't be doing this, so very grateful to them and to be able to offer this up to our community. Today, our community sponsor is Express Employment Professionals, and Chris Petty is with us from Express today. So as I mentioned, today's topic is going to be what are the trends in the workforce issues that are happening out there? What's the data saying from our own Damon Rundberg? And what do we see trending not only from as a result of the last year or so, but what does the road look like ahead? What extrapolations can we take from what we've learned over the last year and a half plus at what might be coming down the road with these trends in our community? So a couple of announcements. We've got some events coming up at the Chamber I wanted to share with you. The first one is that our annual business awards, formerly known as SAGE, are the Bend Chamber Business Excellence Awards, and that is coming up on February 3rd. It's a celebration of businesses and individuals who have really done a stellar job in our community, and we hope you all can join us. It will be an in-person event. Tickets go on sale January 6th, so be looking for that. And also, the second part of today's webinar will be in the form of a What's Brewing. And if those of you who don't know what that is, What's Brewing is a in-person event that we used to hold almost monthly. We're going to go back to trying to hold those in person with safety protocol, of course, sometime in late January. And the topic for the next What's Brewing is kind of the follow-on to this one. Now that we go through all the trends and what's actually happening on the ground, numbers-wise, industry-wise, what can we do as employers to actually attract and retain our employees? And how do we keep that workforce that we're fighting so hard to retain these days? So that comes up in January. So with that, I'd like to get going on today's topic, and I'll introduce our two speakers. First up today is Damon Rundberg. I don't feel like I really need to introduce you, Damon, because we all know you. I've been watching you in so many different ways over the years. But he's the Central Oregon Regional Economist for the Oregon Employment Department and the Wizard of Data, or Guru, whatever movie set you subscribe to. And then also today we have Chris Petty. He's the franchise manager for Express Employment Professionals. He'll be talking a little bit about some of the trends they're seeing in the employment and placement end of the spectrum. Damon's going to talk about the data, what is happening out there with unemployment by industry sector and other trends that he's seeing. So with that, Damon, I'm going to let you go ahead and take it from here.
All right, thanks, Katie, and thanks so much for having me, Ben Chamber. I really appreciate the platform to reach out and update you all what we're seeing across the regional economy in this pretty bonkers period that we've been seeing of economic decline and then rapid recovery. We're now sitting here over a year and a half after, what we could consider one of the most significant economic shocks in basically all of our lifetimes. And yet a year and a half later, the economy, as we would measure it and locally, is pretty much recovered, which is a truly amazing thing to say. But for many of us, it doesn't feel like the economy is the economy we came from, right? It doesn't feel recovered. There's not a lot of people shooting off fireworks and excitement that we've come back from the precipice of this devastating recession. And that's really interesting. And I think some of the reasons why are that, we're still experiencing this dramatic labor tightness that exists. And so that doesn't feel great if you're an employer. We are talking, the conversations about inflation are everywhere. You can't lose sight of those. And then yet another, potential COVID wave coming down the pipe with Omicron. So, there's just a lot of stuff that just doesn't feel celebratory, despite the fact that a lot of the indicators would say that we've largely recovered from this massive shock that we just underwent. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at where we came from and where we're at today. And hopefully at the end of that, we might be able to find an answer there if we should be optimistic about this recovery, or if we've really just put a Band-Aid over the wound, if you will. So let's take a look at employment trends. And this is going to be a little bit different than the employment trends that I usually share with you all. Traditionally, we talk about seasonally adjusted total non-farm employment is our rock hard data that we talk about when we're looking at employment trends over time. Unfortunately, the seasonal adjustment is getting a little bit wonky in the world in the era of COVID. And I'll show you an example in the next slide of why that's the case. But what we're looking at here is monthly employment relative to what the same month was in 2019. 2019 was before the pandemic. So basically, if you get monthly employment for that particular month above what it was in 2019, you could kind of consider that we've got back to those pre-COVID levels of employment. And you see Deschutes County here is the blue line. And, you go back to April of 2020, right when the onset of the pandemic began, and you could see we lost our employment levels in April of 2020 were over 15% lower than they were in 2019, of April of 2019. Just a devastating drop there in employment numbers. And there was a lot of debate back then about what the shape of the recovery was going to look like. And it turns out that the V-shaped recovery people were mostly right, although I think I would call this a lazy V-shaped recovery because it definitely sort of tails off on the right-hand side here. But we've never seen a recovery that looks like this. We've never seen a recession that looks like this. We've also never seen a recovery that looks like this. Really, really impressive. And you can see Deschutes County here, we sort of started surpassing 2019 levels of employment by the time we got to this last spring of 2021. And we sort of hovered around that dotted line for much of the spring and summer. I will note that the most recent few months there haven't been benchmarked to payroll tax records, so not quite as confident in the trend there, especially that flat period. But either way we slice it, we're seeing that employment levels are definitely back to where they were pre-recession. And that's great news. And this is employment in local businesses, business payroll employment. As far as Oregon, which is the orange line you could see here, you could see not hit nearly as hard in the initial COVID losses. And it also really impressive recovery and expansion not expansion yet for the state as a whole, but still sitting with employment levels down about 3% from what they were before the onset of the pandemic. So a little bit of a lag as far as recovery, but this is our norm in Central Oregon. With recessions, we tend to have really poor resistance. We don't fight off recession particularly well. We get hit harder on initial losses. But we have some of the best recoverability in the nation. We bounce back from recessions really quickly, and this recession has been no exception to that rule. So I had made a comment that I normally would talk about seasonally adjusted total non-farm employment when we're looking at business jobs in local businesses. There has been a bit of a decoupling of the seasonally adjusted trend from the not seasonally adjusted trend. And so if you look at the seasonally adjusted trend, as of October, it actually looks like we're just shy from being recovered from the pandemic. If you look at the non-seasonally adjusted trend, it looks like we've just recovered. It doesn't really matter which one you look at. Both of them are right around that dotted line, which means we're basically back to pre-pandemic levels. But if I were you, I'd focus more on the not seasonally adjusted because of some wonkiness going on with the factors there. But moral of the story, like I said, we're either recovered or right there about to, depending on which series you look at. And not all industries were impacted equally. So on aggregate, our employment totals have recovered. However, the trend and the impacts from COVID has been really different depending on which industry sector you look at. And if you've heard me talk at any point over the last year and a half, some of this is going to sound really familiar and feel familiar. What we're looking at here is so employment in October of 2020 is what the golden bars are relative to what they were in 2019 before the pandemic. And the green represents what October employment was this most recent October compared to what it was in October of 2019. So basically the middle of the pandemic and then where we're at today relative to pre-pandemic times. And I've sort of lumped in my head, I think of the impacts on industries in sort of three different categories. The first are those industries that have seen little impact from COVID. Not a lot of them, but there are a few. And those are the two at the top that you can see there, construction and financial activities. You can see actually construction employment was actually up in October 2020 relative to what it was before the pandemic. So there's really very little impact from an employment perspective on construction. And now it's sitting over nearly 9% up from what it was in 2019. And financial activity, same story, is sitting up significantly from what it was in 2019. Now, this isn't banking jobs specifically. Most of the growth in financial activities is housing related. And so these two together are housing related industries, which no surprise that that's an area, thank God it's an area where we haven't seen any job losses because many of you are likely familiar with the fact that we've been in a bit of a housing supply crunch for, let me check my watch, forever. And it has really gotten worse during the pandemic. And so seeing that these two industries continue to grow and expand is really encouraging. And we want to see more growth there as well going into the future. The second category of industry that's been impacted by COVID are those that saw big impacts early on, but actually saw really rapid recovery. And so there's a few that fall into this category, which include manufacturing, other services, which is the worst catch-all and title for an industry that exists. I apologize. And then government. So those are the three that were impacted, but have since recovered. Manufacturing first. I mean, the losses you could see there, over 8% drop in employment of what it was in October 2020 compared to 19. But now it's sitting up over 3% from those 2019 levels. Really encouraging rebound we've seen here. Most of the losses in manufacturing revolved around our brewing sector. A lot of breweries produce kegs that go to restaurants. And in the midst of the pandemic, the sort of last spring and summer, when restaurants were closed or takeout service, you didn't see a lot of kegs going to those restaurants or being consumed. Those breweries that had bottling or canning lines did okay, but that's not all the breweries. A lot of them do sort of serve restaurants or pubs. But there's been a big rebound here, really encouraging on the manufacturing front. As far as other services, that's mostly your personal care services. So, massage therapy, hair and beauty, stuff like that. Those have all sort of bounced back to pre-COVID levels. And government is back, although even within government, there's some different trends there. We still see that education is still lagging a little bit, but I don't think for lack of wanting to hire, I think they're more difficult getting back to where they were because they can't find workers at this point. But they have the job ads that are out there. And then our last category of industries impacted by COVID are those industries that were hit hard and are continuing to recover at this point, have not yet recovered. And the big one to talk about here is leisure and hospitality. But I think this is actually a really encouraging story and not a discouraging one. In October of 20, you saw that employment in leisure and hospitality was still down 14% in Deschutes County relative to what it was in 2019. 14%. It's at the peak, over 20% of jobs were lost. It was closer to 30, to be honest. But yet, by the time we get to October of 21, this last October, we see that employment levels are only down about 3.5% from what they were pre-COVID. That is a remarkable recovery. And I would imagine by the time we get to this next spring or early summer, leisure and hospitality in Deschutes County and Central Oregon will be completely recovered, which is something I just did not think I would be saying this time last year. Just unprecedented recovery there. As far as our communities within Deschutes County, and I could have included this and expanded it to other parts of Central Oregon, including Prineville and Madras, and I did not for this, but the trend is very similar there. We see that most of our communities across Deschutes County have recovered. We're looking, you'll see here, the timeline has shifted a little bit. We're not talking about October numbers, we're talking about June. And that's because for city data, we only have it through June where we have payroll tax records. But at least as of the beginning of this summer, we see that all of our big communities, our larger cities had got back to 2019 levels. Bend and Redmond they just barely got back to those 2019 levels. The only one that continues to lag behind is Sun River, with employment levels still down about 7.5% in June of 2021 compared to what it was in June of 2019. That's the encouraging piece about that is that for the most part, we've seen visitation has bounced back in Sun River, definitely exceeding pre-pandemic levels. Employment hasn't bounced back, but I would expect that over time, since the visitation is there, that those sort of services to tourists and visitors will see employment bounce back in the near term future as well. Sisters might stand out like a sore thumb for you if you look at the top there, with employment up 6% almost from what it was before the pandemic. This is an amazing story for Sisters of growth in manufacturing and the professional and technical services. A lot of diversification in Little Old Sisters. It's not just a little tourism town anymore. So a really cool story coming out from the west side of the county. So we've seen this dramatic improvement on the employment numbers, which is great. So employment in local businesses is back to what it was pre-pandemic on average. And at the same time, we've also seen incredible improvement on the unemployment side, which you would expect, right? I mean, these are two sides of the same coin. As employment rises, the number of people who are unemployed tends to go down. That's how it usually works. And that's what we've seen here. And I'm showing here on the green line, you can see unemployment insurance claims, and the blue line are those who are statistically unemployed. Just as a reminder, to be statistically unemployed and to have an unemployment insurance claim are not the same thing. You could be unemployed statistically without qualifying for unemployment insurance benefits. And you can see that's why there's always more unemployed people than there are UI claims. But generally speaking, they should and do move together. They trend in the same direction. And that has been true, except that you'll notice that there's a bit of a lag or a gap between the number of unemployed and those on UI claims that still sort of exists. And that's been a head scratcher for some. We're sitting with, as of October, the number of statistical unemployed is up 14% from what it was pre-pandemic. But the number on an unemployment insurance claim, there's only about 0.5% more than what it was before the pandemic. So we're basically back to levels of UI claim activity that we saw before the pandemic, which is pretty wild when you look at that spike that we saw there in the spring and summer of 2020. So why is it that there's this gap or this lag that still sort of exists between these two? In the fact that it also seems like the business employment numbers have recovered faster than the statistical unemployed. And there are a few reasons for that. So the first one is basically just a revision technicality, which is that these labor force statistics, the unemployed, we revise these, we do big revisions on these or benchmark them annually, whereas the employment numbers in local businesses, we actually revise those on a rolling basis each quarter as payroll tax records come in. So we sort of have more concrete confidence in those business employment numbers. I'm pretty sure that when we get around to revising these at the end of the year, we're going to see the number of unemployed get revised down pretty dramatically across the region. Especially if the UI claim activity is any indicator of where we might be going here. Another reason why we see a bit of a lag here, why the number of unemployed is still lagging behind the number of folks who are working in local businesses, is quits. There is incredible demand for labor out there, which we'll get to in a second here. And that has led to, Katie even alluded to it, she mentioned the Great Resignation. There's been a really high rate of quits across the nation, and Central Oregon is no exception there. With all these opportunities out there, workers are finding opportunities in higher paying jobs that are more flexible, better suit their career goals, whatever it might be. And so we're seeing these quits happen, and most people who quit a job become statistically unemployed for usually at least a month. And so that could explain some of the reason why the unemployed is still a little bit elevated relative to these other indicators. And then the last reason why unemployed still might seem a little elevated is impacts from self-employed individuals. Self-employed usually don't respond that they're unemployed. When you're self-employed, you're sort of always doing your work, always doing your business, right? But during the pandemic, there was a new expansion of unemployment insurance that expanded UI to self-employed workers for the first time ever. And that led to sort of a surge in self-employed workers identifying themselves as unemployed. And I think that we're still seeing a little bit of that in the data today. But generally speaking, we wouldn't necessarily consider those who are self-employed workers who are saying they're unemployed as part of an available pool of workers that a local business could hire from. So don't necessarily think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities in hiring those individuals. Not that you couldn't, but that they're likely going to be looking to go back to their self-employed position when they get the opportunity. All right, so please forgive me really quickly for my corny use of clip art here. I probably haven't used clip art since the mid-2000s, the aughts, if you will. But it's not every day that I create a graph that looks perfectly like a wave. So surf's up, high surf warning. What we're looking at here on this graphic is the number of unemployed workers per job ad. So the ratio between the supply of labor and the demand for labor. And this is one of my favorite graphics to talk about when people have a conversation about how tight is the labor market today. This is the graph you should focus on, because in a situation where that ratio is high, when there's a lot of unemployed workers per job ad, it means that we're not in a tight labor market. It means that businesses that are hiring have a glut or an abundant supply of workers to hire from, very little competition for those workers. And in the inverse, when this ratio is low, it means there are very few unemployed workers out there per job ad in the market. And that means that you're in a very tight labor market, and it's going to be hard for businesses to find workers. It's going to be easy for workers to find jobs, and workers have a lot more value, which means you tend to see wage gains in situations where this ratio gets really low. Well, you can see today where we're at. And this is a 12-month moving average, by the way. So the actual raw number for October is actually far lower than what this 12-month moving average is. But you can see that we're sitting at historically low or meeting or reaching historically low levels of unemployed workers per job ads. So this is, in other words, amongst the tightest labor markets we've ever seen in Central Oregon. So that feeling that people say, oh yeah, the market's tight, it is statistically, it confirms that it is in fact very tight out there. What's interesting, though, is we got here in a very different way than we did in other tight labor market situations. We already just talked about how the fact that there's still a marginally higher number of unemployed workers than there was back in 2019. But how did we get to a labor market that's as tight or tighter than what it was before the pandemic? And it's actually not through the supply side, through less unemployed workers. It's actually because we have significantly more job ads. The demand for labor is the highest we've ever seen before, nearly double what it was in 2019. So when you take the fact that we have a marginally higher number of unemployed workers, but we have double the number of job ads, it means that this ratio has really shrunk to these historically low levels today. So this one is the graph that we want to pay attention to going forward, and what it might mean for how long we can expect to be in a tight labor market situation. So really quickly, I'll finish up with this. So why is it today that we're in a tight labor market? I already just hit the nail on the head. For the most part, the reason why it's a tight labor market today is because of unprecedented demand. We've never seen hiring levels such that they are today. And for the most part, on the supply side, it's only marginally more unemployed available workers than we would have seen had COVID not existed. So that demand is the thing that, if you say one of these things is not like the other, it's the demand side that is really through the roof there. But at the same time, there are a lot of small variables together that are suppressing the labor supply, that are making the situation even worse. And I'll walk through a few of the examples here. So first is that we have fewer people who are holding multiple jobs. Now, societally, we would consider this a very good thing, right? We would hope that folks can have opportunities where they just hold one job and that sort of pays the bills for them. But that's not the case for a lot of folks in our community. Multiple job holding is fairly prevalent. But we've actually seen in the last year or so that multiple job holding has gone down, which means that even though I'm one worker, I could fill two jobs technically if I'm holding multiple jobs. And that's, with that happening less, that means that there's sort of less of those jobs being filled, especially the sort of part-time type jobs. Number two, retiring workers. The baby boomers were going to retire, are retiring, will continue to retire. That's baked into the equation, the demographics. We knew that was happening. There has been an acceleration of retirements, depending on what indicator you look at. It's either accelerating or sort of continuing at a pretty normal pace there. But either way, that is happening. And then you can see this in PT attached. What I'm saying here is part-time attached workers. There are a lot of folks who retire from their career, but continue to engage in the labor market part-time. And my mom is a great example of this. She's a retired teacher. And she does substituting on the side. And for about 2 years or a year and a half, she stopped doing her substitute teaching during the depths of COVID. She didn't really want to sort of put herself out there as an older woman and in the middle of a pandemic and a health crisis. And so she decided not to do that. And there are a lot of these older workers who are marginally or partially attached to the labor market, who sort of pulled back in the last year and a half. And we would hope to see some of that increase. And if anecdote means anything here, my mom is back to subbing here in the Bend LaPine School District. So good news that she's making a little bit of a dent on her own there. But another thing that's suppressing the labor supply are remote workers. And this isn't what you think. This is actually looking at a LinkedIn study that recently came out, and many of you may have seen this in the news, I'm not sure, where LinkedIn was looking at the workforce, the job search history of workers within the metro areas across the U.S. And they found that the workforce in Deschutes County in the Bend MSA had the highest share of the workforce that was searching for remote work opportunities. Okay. What does that mean exactly? That means that workers who live here are looking for remote jobs, despite the fact that a lot of businesses are hiring. Why might they be doing that? Well, remote jobs on average tend to pay quite a bit more than local employers do. And I think that this is honestly a big reflection of our cost of living and the housing struggles that we've had across the region, which is it's becoming increasingly difficult for workers to find jobs that allow them to stay here. And a remote job that pays more than a local employer definitely can help get them and get a higher income for them to stay here. But this is a sort of a catastrophe for local employers, because what this means is they're not just competing with each other local employers, they're now competing with remote jobs that are being listed out there. So something to pay attention to going forward. Last few things really quick. The Great Resignation, we've already talked about the churn or the quits. As workers find new jobs and they're churning out from one to another, it's creating just more periods where businesses have to be filling in these gaps, and that's really difficult. It takes time to hire someone. It takes time to train someone to get them proficient in a job, and so there could be a lot of inefficiency in that process. So this is really disruptive to a lot of businesses. Although at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that these are great opportunities for workers to sort of move up in their career, which don't happen in every instance throughout the labor market. And then finally, there's still some miscellaneous pandemic concerns that are out there. People concerned about health and wellness, childcare issues, quarantines, all of the other sort of pandemic-y things that are still happening, suppressing the labor market. So those are the big reasons why we're in a big, tight labor market today. And we're standing on this razor's edge or this tightrope. And I think for many years, we were pretty close to an equilibrium between the supply and demand for labor, and never realized how precarious we were in this balancing act of equilibrium. And if COVID has taught us anything, is that our labor market conditions are much more susceptible to shocks than we ever realized before. So with that, I will turn it over back to Katie, and I think we'll do questions at the end. So I won't answer any questions right now, correct?
That's right. That was great stuff, Damon. Really good. And I forgive you for the clip art.
Thank you. My millennial was showing.
It's okay. Great stuff. Lots of food for thought there. But now we're going to go ahead and move on to Chris Petty from Employment Express. And he's going to share with us, again, some of the information regarding wages and employer retention rates and some of those other issues that many of us have been dealing with out here as employers as we compete for that downward trend in the wave. So take it away, Chris. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Hey, well, Katie, thank you so much for the introduction. And I just want to thank Ben Chamber for inviting me to speak today. I'm Chris Petty. I'm our franchise manager here at Express Employment Professionals in Central Oregon. We service all of Central Oregon, and so we've been really able to support as many people as possible and as many companies as possible through this very different time. Wage is probably the question that I get asked the most about, especially with clients or organizations that I work with that are trying to see if what they offer is competitive. And some of our historical data, and I apologize, I don't have a cool slide or anything or any cool clip art like Damon did. So you just got to look at this handsome face while I talk. But in 2019, our average hourly pay rate for all of our associates for the year of 2019 was $14.75. So that includes industrial, manufacturing, administrative, professional positions. We were at $14.75. And when I ran the report this morning, our average hourly pay rate for all of those for our year to date so far is up to $17.50. Is what we've found is that the unemployment benefits that people were getting at the beginning of the pandemic were paying them really well. And a lot of people, especially here in Central Oregon, have become reliant on those higher wages. And to try and get the workers to come back and actually work in person, companies have had to raise their pay rates across the board. One of our largest clients that we do service has done an increase of, depending on the position, up to $6 more than what they were doing just in January of 2021 as well. So we're seeing a really big shift in pay rates being increased for those entry-level positions. Another thing that we've kind of noticed that kind of goes hand in hand with that, and I think speaks to who's retiring, is that a lot of the people that are retiring now, they wear multiple hats. And so a company may be looking to say, hey, I have Steve Smith and Steve Smith does A, B, and C for me, but their title is really only this one thing, and they're trying to find somebody that can come in and fully replace that person. And they're realizing, well, we've had somebody here for so long that they've taken on more projects and learned new things, that where we had one person doing this position, we're now actually needing to hire 2 or 3 to get those same results that we were seeing beforehand. And it's kind of a hard pill to swallow sometimes, saying I'm adding 3 people to my payroll to do what Steve did for me for 30 years. But then if you factor in the fact of Steve working there, and again, Steve Smith is a fake person. It's the fake name I use all the time. But if you factor in that training and that development over those 30 years, you're probably actually were underpaying Steve for what they really did for your business. Another question we get asked a lot about is retention rate. And I think Damon did a fabulous job of explaining why retention at companies has been pretty low. We see it here. You know, we're full service. We can fill literally every position and even have a healthcare division here out of our office as well now. But it's an employees market. I have people that'll come in and meet with my team, and we will get excited about a job. They are set to start at that position. And it turns out that, by the time that they left our office and were driving home, they got offered a position that pays 50 cents more. And people are leaning with the money right now. If they see that they can get 50 cents more an hour in a position that maybe they're not as passionate about, they are going to go where the money is. There's just so many options for workers out there right now. I wish it was like that when I graduated years ago, but it wasn't. And there's just a huge demand for people. And that bottom line, if you're wondering why you're not seeing the applicants, it's you really have to look at your pay rates and look at your benefits that you're offering. There was kind of a push pre-pandemic for those extra benefits of the things that keep people on with a company. And I will tell you that has really moved away. I speak with candidates all the time that, we try to sell them on benefits that are offered or fun things that are about working with certain companies. And at the end of the day, they say, bottom line is I need to know what my pay rate is going to be. And I need to know, I need to find the best one possible. I remember when I entered the workforce when I was 16 years old and was making $6.25 an hour and was thrilled that every 2 hours pre-tax I was getting $12.50, and I thought it was fabulous. We speak with people that just graduated high school that are looking for $18, $20 an hour right off the bat. And it can be hard, especially for this generation, to kind of accept that you need to get your foot in the door somewhere and work your way up, get promoted, show that hard work to get to those pay levels that you need to get to. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations have raised to those levels that they can go and get in at those entry-level people at $18 to $20 an hour to come in and do whatever the work is that they need. Damon touched on this with kind of trends that we're seeing in 2022. But a big thing that we've noticed out of our office is that there are far fewer people that are open to doing contract or temporary positions, especially here in Central Oregon. We have nearly 900 branches worldwide. And I talk to a lot of those branches, even the ones maybe just in the Portland metro area, and they have a bigger supply of people that are open to doing those multiple jobs. A lot of people want to stick with one thing and they want it to pay well, and they want to have a set schedule, and that's it. We historically, being one of the oldest express offices in the entire world, we have a really, really rich database. And a lot of those people that we've been able to reach out to in the past that are open for those temporary assignments or contract assignments, like Damon mentioned, they've decided to actually retire. They've decided that it isn't worth them to go and do temporary assignments. So we really have been pushing all companies across Central Oregon of moving into longer term, even if those are part-time positions. There's also just less people that are open to part-time work now. Again, with those benefits that people were getting during the early stages of the pandemic, they've come to rely on what those wages are, and they want to have a full-time position, but they also want a whole lot of flexibility. Some of the companies that we work with that I've spoken to that have been able to grow and keep their retention, their biggest thing is being flexible with their workers, letting them set their own schedules, which I know everybody's saying, well, I can't do that. And I totally understand. I'm not saying this is something for all industries that everybody can do. but they're reducing the amount of time that it takes to get somebody onboarded. They're maybe taking some of the screening that was happening beforehand, and they're not doing it anymore. And they're saying, moving forward, we need to get people in this desk or at this plant as soon as possible. And so they're reducing the onboarding time, they're upping the wages, but they're also giving a lot of flexibility. And some of that flexibility comes with childcare issues or just other family members and working around their schedules to make sure that there is always someone at home. Excuse me. Other trends that we are seeing in 2022 is the desire for remote work. And Damon hit it on the head is it's not remote workers that are living in Central Oregon and working for employers in Central Oregon. They're living in Central Oregon and they're working for a company on the East Coast. They're working for a company in Seattle or even Portland. And they are liking that remote flexibility because with the ups and downs in childcare and remote schooling that can happen from time to time. And they're there so they can still make sure that their household is taken care of. And as Damon said, remote positions often do pay very well and are very competitive with the rates that we have here locally. So people are jumping on those positions and they're getting sent new laptops and webcams and printers to basically set up an office in their own home. I did remote work personally for about 2 months at the beginning of the pandemic, and I went stir crazy. So whenever I look at jobs that I see remote, I automatically know that would not be for me because I like to be in the environment. It's not the case for most people in the current workforce. They're looking for those remote positions and they will jump on them right away. And again, the time that it's taking them to get onboarded with those companies has been reduced significantly. It's something that is truly only going to get worse. And that's why it's really our job as employers here in Central Oregon to do whatever we can to maintain the people that we have here. Cost of living is really high. We all know it. I think the age-old saying that I learned when I moved here is it's poverty with a view. And I hate to say it, but a lot of those workers that we're looking at in manufacturing, in really anything like industrial, custodial, hospitality, they can't afford to live in Bend or Redmond. And so they're moving out of the area. And so there's those workers that we had before that we could call on and rely on. And one thing I learned about Central Oregon, which I absolutely love, is that people live in the towns that they live in because they want to work there. They love that town. They love that community. And the idea of a commute just isn't as normal as it is in major metropolitan areas. So it's something that we work with employers all the time on saying, what can we do to decrease the time it takes for somebody to get started with your company and increase their benefits and their starting pay rates. And that might mean that person isn't going to get a raise for a year or 2 years or until a promotion or something like that. But whatever we can do to really make sure that we hold on to the great people that we do have here in our community. The only other thing that I would really like to share before we pop over to our Q&A section is that if you are an employer here in Central Oregon and you're having issues finding people and you just want to chat and see if there's some creative ways that we can find people for you, please give me a call here at Express. You'll see I got my now hiring sign in the background. I always have it on here for Zoom calls. But even if you're not looking to work with us, if there's anything we can do to kind of help you, our local great companies and clients that are here in Central Oregon, we would love to be a resource in any way possible. A lot of you know Karen Turner in our office. Our previous owner, Stephanie Miller and Connie Drewliner, are still very involved with our business. And we would all love to be a resource for everybody that's on the call today. But thank you again, Katie, for letting me speak today. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Damon. We've got one question in the queue, and I've written about 20 on my paper here. So I think we've got enough here to fill the next 15, 20 minutes. But please, if you have questions or any follow-up comments, put them in the Q&A section, and we'll try and get those on the air here. So the first question in the queue would be whether you can address any data. And Damon, I guess this is between you and Chris, you might want to weigh on this as well, on the disconnect between job requirements and worker skill experience. So there are a lot of folks out there really desperate to bring on board some new employees, and they're finding a disconnect with what they really need in skill sets and what's actually available. Have you seen that trend? Is it apparent in the data that people are jumping from one type of industry to another? And then what do you see happening to get those employees up and running, or the impacts to employers as they hire folks that may not have the same skill set as we had before? Damon, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first on this one. So first, I mean, the term that you'll often see revolving around this question is like a skills gap. Like that's the common terminology to hear. I do not think we have a skills gap today. When we are in a tight labor market, there is, once again, we're talking about a relatively low supply of workers for a lot of demand. And at that point, I mean, it's a very competitive market for workers. And so that means for them, the best, the brightest, the all-stars out there are happily employed somewhere. Maybe they're actually looking to move somewhere else to get somewhere even better or better pay, whatever it might be. But if you're looking at sort of the pool of workers who are actively seeking work, who are not currently employed, you're often talking at this point in the labor market, like that's a barriered population. Oftentimes, those are folks who are struggling, maybe looking for something very specific, have very specific skills, or they're also people who are looking for, maybe they have childcare constraints, transportation constraints, a disability, whatever it might be, that sort of more unique circumstances for those individuals. The other thing too is there's sort of an abundant demand for the lowest wage workers. And we've seen a lot of low wage workers transfer up in the scale to new jobs, new opportunities. And so there's a real hole there for the lowest wage workforce. In fact, we did some recent work where we tracked restaurant workers who were laid off during the pandemic through time to find out what happened to them. Wanting to see, were these folks coming back into the restaurant sector or not? And there has been the results a year later, looking at that same cohort 1 year after getting laid off during COVID. There has been about double the pace of job hopping into different industries than what we ever saw before the pandemic. So a lot of these folks, whether it's they think that the industry has the stink on it, which I don't think is fair to restaurants, totally not their fault. But that did happen in construction in the last recession a little bit, or just, better pay, better opportunities, better hours, whatever it is, you're seeing these folks move to other industries. So that job hopping is a reality. And so I don't think that there's, so in this type of labor market, yes, it would be and should be hard to find workers. The other piece of her question, though, is interesting because she asked about the job seekers who are not getting offers. And to be honest, we don't have any data on this, but I'm increasingly seeing conversations about this happening where people are applying for jobs, many jobs, and not getting callbacks. I don't have a good answer for that. But that is concerning if that's the case. If there's some secret, ghost trend where, a lot of these job ads are not substantive real ads or something like that. I don't know, because it is something that I've now heard a few times. But yeah, no data to speak to that specifically.
Okay, thanks, Damon. Chris, you want to add on to any of that?
Yeah, well, I think, Damon, you're absolutely correct. So a lot of people that were laid off at the beginning of the pandemic and were receiving unemployment benefits, a lot of people, and I have, quite a few friends that did the same thing. If they went back to school and they learned new skills and where they might have, certificates of training and completion, they don't have the actual on-the-job experience that is required in a lot of the positions. And so they've decided, yes, I was this before, but I want to make a change over here. Or even if they didn't go and do any schooling or training or anything like that, they realized in that long time that they were staying at home that they didn't want to return to what they were doing beforehand. One thing that I'm a firm believer of, and I tell everybody I work with, is that there's two important parts to hiring a successful employee. There's skills and there's personality. And I can come and I can start working with Damon and I can learn new skills every single day as he's training me and teaching me and grooming me. But the one thing that Damon can't teach or change in me is my personality. And so I always tell employers, let's focus on that personality. Let's focus on that fit with your team and that drive, because you're going to need to invest in your people to train them and give them the skills that they have to be the best possible worker for you. That's what our workforce is right now. So if we focus on those things, you will find good people that will want to stay with you because they're going to love the dedication that you put into them. And also they're going to fit in with your team, and they're going to feel like every day they're coming to work with their friends. So that's one big kind of change in mindset that we really have to adapt here during the pandemic.
Great, good input. Any follow on to Damon's last issue and the last part of that question about no callbacks?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person, I don't like notifications on my phone. I don't like an email unread. And so I know that we are very good with getting back to our candidates. But again, I think it sticks to that point of when you're just looking at a resume that's submitted on whatever database that you're putting it into. If you're not seeing those specific skill sets that or experience, people are often just, I'm not going to get back to this person. There's a reason why companies stopped putting pay rates in job descriptions, because they were just getting a lot of people that didn't have the skills for those positions. I personally think you need to put a pay rate in every single job that you put out there, to not get somebody's hopes up, to realize they're the perfect fit, but it's not in what they're looking for. But I know companies have become increasingly frustrated with the number of applicants that they're getting that aren't meeting their basic minimum requirements. And again, I think that goes to a shift of, yes, we have this nice piece of paper that lays out the things that they've done in the past, and the education or whatever it may be that they have on there, but kind of refocusing on what is this person actually like? Do they have drive, and do they have grit and determination? If you have those three things, you can join my team any day, because I will train you in the things of staffing and employment that you need to know. So I would say that's probably the biggest part of it. But I do hear from candidates all the time of, I applied at such and such company. They're really well known. I put in 3 applications. I never heard anything back. And for me, that's frustrating, because I had the same experience when I first graduated of never hearing back from anybody. So I would say that's kind of probably where it leads to, or where it comes from. But there's definitely a shift in how that can be fixed.
I also wonder if it has to do with, Zip Recruiters and Indeed and those programs that are out there that are filtering things for you. And it's really easy not to respond, rather than let an algorithm find recruits. And maybe the disconnect there is not letting folks know. I don't know, just a thought. Moving on to the next.
Katie, one follow-up on that, though. I'm that's sort of a big macro conversation about the technology of hiring people and how that all works. But I think that what is interesting is, depending on where we are in the labor market conditions, businesses and workers need to sort of adapt to knowing where we're at. So like in a time when we're in a relatively low supply of labor and a big demand, it means that you might, as a business, have to sort of loosen your requirements a little bit. Try to find the person who that is 90% of the way there, that you could skill up that extra 10%, whatever it might be. And sometimes I worry that some of the technological efficiencies that we've created in hiring processes sort of miss the nuance of where we're at in the labor market conditions, and saying, like, that person who's 90% of the way there maybe it got kicked out automatically of being screened. And that's sort of a shame, because that person might have been a great candidate, and just a little bit of on-the-job training would have got them there. So that's like I said, a bigger conversation. But we as humans can adapt to these economic conditions relatively quickly. Sometimes an algorithm maybe isn't as efficient as we are in that regard.
Yeah, that is a totally different big topic. I'm going to move on because I want to get to some other questions here. Can you speak to how youth labor participation is happening as employers have become more desperate for workers? Are younger folks engaging in the workforce? Both of you could probably take a whack at that answer.
The data says yes. It's the unemployment rate for youth is the lowest on record, which the record doesn't go back that far. I think it's like the mid 70s or something like that. But It is phenomenal. A concern that I had for many, really a decades long trend of labor force participation declines from young people, not because they were playing video games or lazy or whatever. Just we had, generation of kids emphasizing higher education and going to college, and that meant that they weren't doing part-time work in college or in high school, and maybe they were trying to do extracurriculars instead to build up their resume for schools, whatever it might be. We were seeing a lot of folks just not doing those jobs that young people tended to do historically. That has really flipped a bit during the pandemic, which is really encouraging. I'm not sure if it's going to stick, but I think there's two reasons why it flipped. One is, if you can get $18 an hour working part-time at McDonald's, that's pretty sweet if you're a junior in high school. So that's number one, is the pay for some of these entry-level jobs is really impressive, inflexible. And then I think number two is they tend to be the people who are the least impacted by pandemic. Health-wise. So you're going to see a lot more 18-year-olds feel comfortable engaging with a public-facing job than you would 55-year-olds. So I think there's a little bit of both of those happening simultaneously.
Anything to add to that, Chris?
No, I was just saying, we've definitely seen an influx of applicants that are 18, 19 years old that graduated on Zoom. And, they which is just, I can't imagine how that was for a senior year for somebody during that time. But we've definitely seen an influx. One of our company policies is that somebody has to be 18 to work with us. And we actually have seen an increase of people reaching out to us that are 16, 17 years old. It's something that we're working on internally to see if it's something we can get around. But yeah, I would say there's definitely an influx of those workers. And again, it's sometimes we need to get out of our head of, oh, well, they're only 18 years old. What do they know? What good habits, bad habits do they have? And giving people a chance, because if somebody wants to work, I want to put them to work, and I want to get them started as quickly as possible. So I'm hoping to see that continue to rise.
So Chris, staying with you for a moment, do you think, and I think you started to address this, do you see employees are less interested in part-time work due to the lack of benefits? Is there a connection there?
Yes. Yeah. Lack of benefits is a huge connection to the reason why people aren't wanting to do part-time. And as Damon mentioned earlier, a lot of those people that were working multiple jobs or working part-time were semi-retired. And so they had decided, hey, I've retired from my career and whatever it was, and I want to go in, I just want to earn a little bit extra money, but I can't earn too much so that I still get all of my benefits that I get. And a lot of those people that I've talked to, they've just decided to stay retired. So part-time work, it's funny. The other thing is with the flexibility of part-time work, we do talk to people frequently who are looking for part-time options, but they have very specific schedules of when they're looking for that part-time. And if that doesn't work with an employer due to their operating hours or whatever it may be, then it's, okay, we need to kind of shift the discussion to a full-time position for that person, or then they will often look at something that is remote. But very specific schedules for people that are looking for part-time work these days.
Right. So Damon, I have a question for you that I've been having a couple of conversations recently about. So union jobs, do you see any trends happening in union jobs that are reflected in the open market as well, or are some things different in that world?
The union stats we have are annual, so we sort of have a general understanding of the share of our workforce that's covered by union membership. It hasn't fluctuated much, but we don't have 2021 data yet, so it's sort of hard to say if that's increased. I know that it's gotten more attention, that there's been some major employers that have seen employees unionize within them. So, but generally speaking, we have a relatively low union participation in Central Oregon. Most of the folks who are in a union shop are usually, most of them are in government or healthcare, and we see very little outside of government and healthcare. So, but this is sort of, once again, talking about trends you see at different parts in the labor market, depending where we are in the surfing graph of the supply of labor relative to the demand, you tend to hear more conversations about workers being interested in union participation, advocating for themselves when their inherent value is larger today than it would have been, a year and some change ago.
Okay. So I have one last question for you both. Top 2 trends that you see continuing in unemployment. Chris, why don't you go first?
I know I'd want to hear Damon's anyways next, because I'm excited to hear about it, since his is a lot of based on data, mine just on experience. Remote work isn't going away. We're not going to see any decline in remote work. I mean, think back to 2 years ago today, and we all thought Zoom was just a word you see in a comic book or something like that, or an old Tim Allen movie. And now technology is really catching up, and laptops and computers are becoming less and less expensive. And so that kind of work is going to just continue to grow. And people are more and more open to it as time goes on. And we've all had experience with that. The other trend that we're going to continue to see is obviously, I think pay rates are going to stay where they're at. A lot of companies were thinking that they could raise their pay rates for a short amount of time, and then when things go back to quote unquote normal, that they would be able to get back to those pre-pandemic levels. That's just not going to be the case. So when making sure, which we always advise, is that if you're going to raise your pay rates, make sure it's something that you can do that's sustainable, and not something that is just a band-aid to put a fix on whatever production deadline or whatever deadline it is that you have in place right now, because you will lose those people as soon as those rates or benefits, whatever it may be, do run out and have to go back down.
Great. Thank you. Damon?
Well, I'm really impressed. Nobody said the word inflation in any of their questions. So that is not something I was going to expect for today. So I'm going to continue that trend and not even touch inflation. But it sort of goes with Chris's comment a little bit about raising wages. I'll say the one thing that we should pay attention to going forward and just expect is that the labor tightness, the tight labor market, is baked in to our reality going forward. This is not a COVID recovery fluke, or there's definitely COVID elements baked into it. But we knew already that with the baby boomers retiring, that there was going to be a real concern about how we were going to backfill that massive workforce of aging workers. On top of that, we've seen essentially no immigration for the last 2 years because of COVID. And so we're not bringing people in from other countries. Visas are all-time lows. That was baked in, and then you add in some of these shifts that we've seen because of COVID. We need to stop thinking about this as like a temporary blip on the radar, and employers need to start planning for the future as if this is going to be how it's going to be. Maybe not to this extent, maybe not this dramatic, because the other way to make the labor market not feel as tight is to see less business hiring, less demand for workers. We don't necessarily want to see that. We want to see businesses doing well and want to be expanding and producing more goods and services and doing well. And so we just got to be ready for this new future that is going to be a tight labor market, which, to be honest, before COVID, we were already in a tight labor market also. So we're pretty accustomed to this at this point.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for the great information that you supplied today. It was really a great conversation. And remind everybody that in January, our next What's Brewing event will focus on retention and what strategies are working out there to attract and keep those employees that you so need. So I also wanted to do one more thank you to both Miller and to SunWest Builders for continuing to support these webinars, and also to Express Employment Pros for sponsoring this particular topic. And I wish you all safe travels out there and a great holiday. Be careful, get up to the mountain, the snow is flying, go partake. And thank you everyone for joining us today.